Since their dramatic and sudden appearance at the end of 1994, the Taliban, drawn from the majority Pashtun ethnic group, which accounts for some 40% of Afghanistan's population today, the infamous group had rarely any fighters that actually fought against the Soviets back in the 1980s. Instead, the vast majority were young Quranic students drawn from hundreds of madrasas, which are Islamic theology schools, that had been set up in Afghan refugee camps in Pakistan. These young men grew up fighting mostly the regime of President Najibullah, who remained in power for 4 more years after the Soviets had left in 1989. But to understand the sudden and dramatic appearance of Taliban in the 1990s, we need to go back a few decades earlier to the events that preceded and paved the way for the rise of such an extremist religious ideology that not only appalled the Afghans but also the Muslim world. My name is Ratko, and this is the Big Idea Society report, Nurturing Great Thinking. In a lead up to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan a decade and a half earlier in 1963, Prime Minister Mohammed Dawood resigned and King Zahir Shah took over as a ruler of Afghanistan. Prime Minister Dawood was close to the Soviet Union and undertaken first steps in modernizing Afghanistan, which was highly unpopular with the conservative Afghans and religious leaders that viewed the development as an attack on Islamic principles. With the appointment of King Zahir Shah, hope was renewed but also quickly extinguished as he continued much in the same footsteps of Prime Minister Dawood, passing further reforms and the new constitution of 1964. Whilst the changes were least felt in the countryside, during this period, Islamism as a counter-reactionary force to communism was starting to be felt in the capital of Kabul, especially amongst the urban elite. And whilst foreign powers were ever more involved in Afghan affairs, the disproportionate balance between the Soviet and American influence was evident. For example, in 1970, 7,000 Afghan army officers were being trained in the Soviet Union, whilst only 600 were trained by the United States. Afghanistan was by far an overwhelming recipient of the Soviet economic aid during this period, and as a direct result, more prone to influence from Moscow. To the Islamists in Kabul, mostly religious scholars educated in Egypt, their country appeared to be weakening and going backwards, with much of the political elite adopting foreign values and ideas. By 1973, Afghanistan was on the brink of crisis. A severe drought devastated the crops, and as a result, Afghanistan's economy spiraled downward. The government faced charges of corruption, and while the king was out of the country for medical treatment, Dawood, former prime minister, is seizing power once again, in a coup to replace what he claimed was ineffective leadership. And whilst in power, he presses on with the reforms, aiming to implement far-reaching social economic changes, but to little effect. He had come to power backed by the Pashtun faction of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA, and regarded the Islamist movement as his enemy. Local government's officers in the districts advised that traditional representative systems were an obstacle to the implementation of the new edicts. Accordingly, the mullahs, khans and maliks started to disappear across the country, being imprisoned or killed. This caused great consternation and resentment among the elites, who immediately started to mobilize against the government. Over his 5-year tenure as president of Afghanistan, Dawood's relationship with the Soviet Union and internal Afghan communists deteriorated gradually, beginning in 1974. This was partly due to Dawood's shift to the right side of the political spectrum and his aligning of Afghanistan away from communism. In one hand, he attempted to break away from accepting foreign military aid from the Soviets, but on the other hand, he continued to push ahead with state-centered economic strategy, which without foreign aid was unfeasible. Dawood's attempts to renovate and improve the government by implementing economic and social reforms would ultimately fail, and the new constitution in February of 1977 did nothing to stabilize the political volatility of the country. After the assassination of Mir Akbar Khyber, a member of the PDPA, and subsequent arrest of its leaders Taraki and Hafizullah Amin, the other prominent group of PDPA, a plan to overthrow President Daoud was being developed, and on April 27, 1978, the coup began with the troops and tanks moving into Kabul International Airport. Insurgent units formed around the capital, and over the course of the day, the number of rebel units steadily increased throughout the city. Within 24 hours, President Daoud and his family were killed in the presidential palace. Afghanistan, now under the control of the communist regime, Nur Mohammad Taraki became president of the Revolutionary Council and prime minister of the Soviet-supported Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. And whilst he had issued various economic and social decrees as part of his Marxist policies, backlash was forthcoming against the monopolistic rule of the PDPA, and consequently revolts emerged everywhere in Afghanistan. The rebellions against these reforms were often violent and often increased into all-out tribal attacks. In October, the Nuristani tribe in the Kunar Valley rebelled, and this initial rebellion inspired other ethnic revolts. Those who tried to oppose the Kalak communist regime were severely punished. More often than not, these traitors were executed. Whilst the forceful policies in political, economic and social change by the Kalak regime faced backlash from the people, a rift between Mohammad Taraki and Hafizullah Amin eventuated in favour of Amin, who took the opportunity of unrest to take control. By spring 1979, more than 85% of the provinces in Afghanistan had revolted against the Kulak regime, and the situation was spiraling out of control. After the death of Taraki under suspicious circumstances, Soviets were desperate to remove Hafizullah Amin from power, but Amin was frantic to change the course of direction, but without much success. On December 27, 1979, Soviet tanks rolled in from the direction of Soviet Republic of Turkmenistan, heading towards Herat and then on to Kandahar, whilst at the same time, Soviet airborne paratroopers and special forces stormed the capital Kabul in the east. The irony here was the Soviets came under the pretense and invitation of the official government to help quell the unrest against the rebels. However, the backlash against the government and our foreign troops only helped garner and intensify the resentment towards the foreign factor. As such, the Mujahideen resistance in Afghanistan was formed, made up of Islamic warrior forces who fought against the Soviet invasion. The United States secretly started to provide arms to the Mujahideen forces, and the CIA provided funding for those efforts. Throughout the 9-year Soviet occupation, the Afghan rebels were significantly financed, armed, and trained by the CIA, beginning with the presidency of Jimmy Carter and continuing under Ronald Reagan, who famously praised the multitude of Mujahideen rebels as freedom fighters. Several other countries contributed support to the Mujahideen against the Soviet army, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Pakistan under the ISI, while the CIA provided funding for the weapons against the Soviets. The ISI determined how to distribute these weapons amongst the Mujahideen parties, and as such, the ISI gave more weapons to the Mujahideen forces they favoured. Over the next 10 years, while the Soviet troops occupied Afghanistan under the pretense of being invited by the central government, the resistance fighters or the Mujahideen would wage jihad or holy war against the infidels or the undesirables, with strong support of foreign military aid. As a result, Afghanistan in the 1980s would become a breeding ground for terrorist training camps and other such rebel activities. With the withdrawal of the Soviets in 1989 and Afghan Mujahideen victorious, the power vacuum that was created ultimately meant the Mujahideen would turn on each other and what was left of the government. United States deemed the Soviet threat neutralized, and lost any further appetite to finance or be involved within the country that was now in a state of chaos and freefall. Between 1989 to 1992, the struggle amongst the different Mujahideen factions and Najibullah's government continued all the way until the government was overthrown in 1992. With the collapse of the government, refugees who in the previous period fled the country now started returning in numbers that were staggering. Some estimate close to 1.2 million people returned from neighbouring Pakistan within a 6-month period. The chaos that grappled the country ultimately gave rise to the Taliban, a group of young men that were outraged what had happened to their homeland and the corruption that was ripe in all corners of the land. Taliban meant students or seekers of knowledge who during their period in refugee camps would receive education and seek to impose a strict allegiance to Islamic law, and as such they developed a politic religious force who were by majority of ethnic Pashtun group. Whilst in Pakistan, alongside religious teaching, they received combat and weapons training from Pakistani's ISI or Inter-Services Intelligence. Over the next 4 years, the Taliban would successfully extend their control throughout 95% of the country, and in 1996, they would have full control in Kabul. This was Big Ideas Society Report. For more content like this, please like, comment and subscribe to the channel.